Yes. Hello and welcome to our third webinar of the academic year, Navigating Complexity from Explorers to Experts, featuring Dr. Brett Jones. My name is Hande Fenerci, and I'm a doctoral student in the Educational Psychology program at Virginia Tech and the co-senior graduate student representative for the Complexity Theories in Education SIG. The purpose of the SIG is to apply, advance, and extend complexity theories to inquiry, research, theory, and practice in a variety of educational contexts. Today, Brett Jones will discuss motivational climate as a complex dynamic system. Brett Jones is a professor in the Educational Psychology program within the School of Education at Virginia Tech. He earned his Bachelor of Architectural Engineering degree from the Pennsylvania State University and his MA and Ph.D. in Educational Psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's held faculty positions as an educational psychologist at Duke University, the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and Virginia Tech. He's taught 24 different types of courses related to motivation, cognition, and teaching strategies, and has conducted workshops and invited presentations at several universities. Dr. Jones's research includes investigating how students' beliefs impact their motivation and examining methods that instructors can use to design instructional environments that support students' motivation and learning. He's currently investigating how the components of the music model of motivation interact to create motivational climates that engage students in their learning. He's received more than $2 million from the National Science Foundation to conduct his research and has published more than 100 articles, books, and book chapters. Dr. Jones will deliver his presentation, and there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones as he discusses motivational climate as a complex dynamic system.
Great. Thank you very much, Hande, for that nice introduction. And give me 1 second here to open up my presentation. And it's good to see you all tonight. I'm glad you took a few minutes out of your busy schedule at this time of year to join us. And I just about have it ready to share here. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks again. I'm pleased to be and honored to be with you all this evening. I'm an educational psychologist, as Hande just mentioned. I specialize in motivation, and I'm a professor at Virginia Tech for the past 18 years or so. And I've been studying aspects of the motivational climate in courses since the 1990s. And I've been trying to apply complex dynamic systems framework to a motivational climate for the past few years. So this is relatively new to me. I'm learning with the help of people like Hande, as well as Avi Kaplan and others in the complexity SIG who I found this SIG really useful for learning about the basics of complexity and some more complicated things too. So this is still a work in progress in terms of trying to understand how to apply complexity to what I've been working on for a while, which is motivational climate. And so today what I wanted to talk about was explain how my lab has been studying issues related to motivational climate for over 2 decades. And then, like I said, more recently, how we've examined it as a complex dynamic system. So this began in the late 90s, where I was teaching courses that either in educational psychology or in motivation, and I would share a lot of theories, not necessarily all 27 shown here. These are just examples of some of the theories. And what I found was that the students in my class, my undergraduate students and graduate students, typically had a hard time summarizing then what they could do as a teacher, because there's so many theories with so many strategies. And so over the years, I started to play around with how these strategies could be grouped together to make it easier for pre-service and in-service teachers to be able to understand them. And so I used an iterative design process basically for 10 years where I was teaching courses at Duke and then at the University of South Florida and then at Virginia Tech. And I was working with pre-service teachers, in-service teachers. I was reading articles and books and going to conferences and talking to people. And it's changed over the 10 years, the things that I found that were important in terms of how we could group them. Well, not what was important, but how to group them. But eventually I found that these five concepts here, groups of strategies, were really great for explaining all the things in these theories. And teachers could understand them, and they were different from one another. And so I started calling it the music model of motivation to help, that's basically an acronym, to help people remember these five categories. And so let me explain each of these five, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the music model. And then the latter part of my talk here, I'll get into complex dynamic systems. And so when teachers use these strategies for empowerment, students feel empowered by having autonomy over some aspects of their learning. In terms of usefulness, students understand why the instruction is useful for their goals in life, either their short-term goals or their longer-term goals. When teachers use the success strategies, students believe that they can succeed if they put forth the effort. And students believe students are interested in and enjoy the content and instructional activities when teachers use these interest strategies. And we view interest here as involving a cognitive component and an emotional component. So feeling excited and enjoyment is also part of the interest category. And finally, when teachers use caring strategies, students believe that others in the learning environment care about their learning and care about them as a person. And so this also includes ideas of belonging, because when students feel that they belong, they feel cared for by others in the learning environment. And these others are who's ever salient. It could be the teacher, and it could be other students in the class if the class involves group work or interacting with other students. And so that was the basics of the music model. And the idea here is that this doesn't replace any other theories. Um, Motivation theories are still very important. It's just that this is a way for teachers to understand current motivational theory and to think about the motivational climate that they're creating in their classroom. So for example, for success, we still know that the idea of self-efficacy as part of social cognitive theory is still really important. And so it's important for students to think about that and for students to think about uh, their students' need for competence and for other theories that might relate to success, such as an entity theory or growth mindset. And so all of these theories are still important, but we're focusing here on what teachers need to do to help students. And then we can also explain to them the reasons why. And that's the motivation theories that we have. Now you might be wondering, okay, that's great, Brett. You have these ideas you came up with over 10 years, but is there any evidence for this? And so what we did over the last 15 years or so is we collected quantitative evidence, and we did this by surveying students about using questions related to these five components. And we did factor analyses and other types of analyses. And we found that, in fact, students can perceive these five different components as different within learning environments. And so we did provide a lot of validity evidence. Here are some of the papers that address this most directly. And a lot of our studies involve validity evidence for these five components that are distinct. Now, they're correlated, but they're also distinct and students can perceive them differently. So now we have a pretty good idea of, okay, this seems to be a real thing. We've done it with first graders, we've done it with elementary students, middle school students, high school students, college students, all the way up through medical school. There's a medical school in New Zealand who's validated the model for use there. So we have good evidence now for those of you interested in that type of thing. That's not really the focus of the talk tonight. It's the fact that how these interactions among these music perceptions leads to the emergence of this motivational climate. And that's what I want to explain a little bit more here before I get into complex dynamic systems theory. And so we define motivational climate as the aspects of the psychological environment that affect students' motivation and engagement within a course. So we have this motivational climate, great. What does that mean? How does that relate to anything? Well, let me explain this a little bit. The reason that these five components of the motivational climate are important is because they predict students' motivation. which we define as their intent to engage in an activity. And so when students are motivated, they're more likely to engage or put forth effort in a course, and then they're likely to learn more and achieve more, which is ultimately what we want in most courses. Now, in terms of antecedents, things that come before the motivational climate and affect it, we know that there's things external to students, like instructors' teaching strategies, and other environmental conditions like the family, their peers, the culture, society in which they live. And these external variables interact back and forth with things that are inside of their head, internal variables, such as their cognition, their affect, their needs and desires, their beliefs about their identity, and their personality characteristics and abilities. And so as these things interact, then they affect students' perceptions of the motivational climate within any course. Now, you could have a great course and students are really motivated and they still don't engage. Why could that be? Well, students are motivated for a lot of things in life. And they may be motivated to play video games, to hang out with their friends, or even to study for other courses that they deem to be more important. So they're constantly making these cost-benefit decisions and deciding, am I going to engage in this particular course and do my homework tonight for that, or am I going to engage in something else? And so that's part of the model as well. Our main focus has been on how can teachers create a positive motivational climate, because we know that doing so then will affect these other components in positive ways. Now, before we get into complex dynamic systems and how that relates, I just wanted to mention how we've measured motivational climate. Typically, it's through these four ways: surveys, interviews, instructors' logs, and observations. And I'll explain some of those as we go through here. But in terms of surveys, we've typically used the music model of academic motivation inventory, which is available for free in the user guide at the Music Model website. And what you'll find there is several different versions. Here's a 19-item version of the college student version. We also have a 26-item. We've translated this scale to 13 different languages, and people around the world are using it. And so there's many different things here in the user guide you can check out. As an example of what we do then, we take these items and we average them to make a scale for each one of the 5 music components. And then based on that, you get a score. And with this average score, you can see sort of where you are with things. Now, in this case, it looks like this teacher probably needs to work on some interest strategies and maybe some empowerment. And so it gives the teacher at least an idea of what their strengths may be as well as their weaknesses. Now, in addition to the quantitative items, we also use some qualitative items, either through open-ended items on surveys or by interviewing them. And so just as an example for interest, we might ask things like, what was interesting about this course and why? Or what could be changed in this course to make it more interesting and enjoyable? We found that getting this feedback, especially as related to all 5 of the music model components, really gives us a good feel for what's going on in the course in terms of the motivational climate. And so that added with the quantitative data that we received through the music inventory can really provide us with a nice description of what's going on in the course. And then we can work with teachers on making changes, or teachers can do it and decide for themselves what they want to do. Okay, so that's sort of the really quick description of the music model, and that's how we look at motivational climate. Now let's talk about complex dynamic systems and how we've started to integrate that into what we're already doing. We have a guiding framework as we think about complex dynamic systems, and we have 4 major aspects of it that we consider. One is the nonlinear complex interactions among variables. Another is the dynamic nature of variable interactions. The third is levels of variables, also known as the units of analysis. And lastly, the context of the system. Now, there are other aspects of CDS, as a lot of you know, and so we're not dismissing those. We think those are important, but we've really prioritized these as a start to get us into this area and to really try to see what's going on. But we do include other aspects at times as well. So for the rest of my presentation here tonight, I'm going to talk about these four different aspects. And so you'll see on the bottom right of your screen, I'll sort of highlight which of these aspects I'm talking about at any one time, and I'll go through one to four. And then I'll use studies as examples of the concepts. So I'm not really going to go through any one study in a lot of detail, but I will highlight some of the work we've done and how it relates to these four aspects of the complex dynamic system. Okay, so with that, let's start with complex interactions. So it becomes difficult to really study this whole music model of motivation because there's too many variables. And even on the left side here, you'll see these internal variables. That's not a comprehensive list. That's just some of the internal variables that we could consider. Same thing with the external variables. There are other things. I just tried to hit on some of the main ones in the highlights. So what we've done, for instance, these boxes shaded in green, we may look at this aspect of the model and see how that's working. So in a lot of different studies, we've looked at how the music components predict engagement, which then predict achievement or learning. And here's an examples of four different studies in which we've done this. And we can see then whether this is really working the way we thought it would. What we found is sort of interesting is that there are differences in the extent of these relationships in different course contexts. So in a psychology course, we may find that empowerment and usefulness are better predictors of engagement, whereas in an online geography course, interest and caring seems to be the significant relationships. And it can be different here in English language courses. And what's interesting is almost always, or always, I can't remember of a case where this wasn't true, all five music variables are correlated with engagement statistically significantly. So they're all correlated, but when you put them all in the model at once, it allows you to see, which ones are really the stronger variables in terms of predicting these other outcomes. And so again, this is nothing new in terms of using structural equation modeling or path modeling or correlations to look at variables. This is what motivation researchers and psychologists have been doing for decades. So there's nothing new about our approach here. What is new is that we included all five of the music components, and that's pretty rare for people to do that. A lot of people might use one or two of these, or three or four of these, or add other variables in, maybe some internal variables. But we've really focused on these five, and sometimes we include other variables as well, but we've really made sure that we get all five of these in here to see what's going on. Okay, so in the future, so let me back up, sorry. You can see here that this is a linear approach, right? There's no complex dynamic system we're studying here, but what we tried to do is just establish the fact that these are related, first of all. And I think as we're going forward here, we're going to start to look at what are the nonlinear relationships between the music variables in different contexts. So maybe, we still have these five components of the motivational climate, but how do they interact with one another? And what are their relationships? That's what I think we need to know more about. Now, some researchers are doing this. They're looking at how, for instance, students' perceptions of interest may increase or decrease depending on how successful students believe that they can be. And they're using utility value interventions to try to manipulate that. So there are people using pieces of this for sure and doing research on this. And we hope to build on that as well by including then all of these music components. Let me give you another example of a study, still focusing here on complex interactions, where this paper was called The Effects of a Collaborative Problem-Based Learning Experience on Students' Motivation in Engineering Capstone Courses. So we're talking about an engineering course, a senior level university course, and they're using problem-based learning. We surveyed students using an inventory. And you can see here, we looked at advisor empowerment, teammate empowerment, usefulness, success, and so forth. And we had some averages here on a scale from 1 to 7. And so we have that. But what I wanted to share mostly here was the fact that then we did interviews. And we ended up coining this term motivating opportunity because we found that depending on what the teacher did, it provided motivating opportunities. Now, the opportunity could be lead to one in which student was motivated and engaged, or this opportunity could have led to something where students actually weren't motivated. And so, for example, looking at the project advisor, and we did this for empowerment, usefulness, success, interest, and caring. Just looking at empowerment here, for instance, if we think about the role of the project advisor, who was another faculty member that was working with like groups of 4 engineering students, um, there was an opportunity for these advisors, these faculty members, to help students make decisions. And so they could either empower them quite a bit by giving them quite a few choices, or they could just tell them what to do. And which is basically no empowerment. There's no autonomy there. And so we found that depending on how the instructor did that, it was an opportunity to either motivate students more or maybe demotivate them and get them annoyed about something or aggravated about the fact that they didn't have any choices. And so those are the types of things that we were looking at. And if we consider the whole model here, then we can see how in the upper left, the project advisor, their role and how they interacted in these problem-based learning environments affected students' perceptions of the motivational climate, which then affected students' motivation and engagement. And so again, they had the opportunity to motivate, but just having the advisors in there isn't enough. The advisors need to think about, okay, how am I empowering students? Am I empowering students or not? And how can I do so in the best way? And so we find that our research is useful for that, then going back to the instructor of this course and saying, hey, your advisors, you need to tell them, here's an opportunity for them that they could really motivate students or really demotivate them. And so this is one thing to think about. Now, there was a lot of other things. If I go back, there's a lot of other aspects, the project design and the group experience and so forth. So that was an interesting study we did related to the complex interactions and us trying to understand what's going on. Let me move on now to the dynamic nature of the interactions and what I mean by that. Here we're talking about the dynamic nature over time. So this model, you can go through here in 1 minute. You can think about it as an hourly type of thing, or after an activity, or after a week, or after a year, any amount of time. And it's up to the researcher or teacher to think about how they're thinking about this, and that depends on their objectives. But let me give you an example that will highlight this. So here we have a student who's in a math course and they got a failing grade on a test. So their achievement was very low. And as a result of that, now they say, oh, I must not be very good at math. That's their belief about mathematics. I'm not very good at math. I don't like math. That's their emotion. And I don't think I'm a math person. They don't identify with the domain of mathematics as a result of that. So next time they go to class, I'm not really that interested. I don't feel like I can be successful in here. And you know what? Maybe I won't even go to class next time, or I don't want to do the homework because I know I'm not going to do that well, so they don't engage. And then we can see how this cycle can continue on a downward spiral. Or it could be that the instructor up here intervenes and really helps the student believe that they can be successful and does what they need to do to help the student succeed. And as a result, we can change that mentality so that the student becomes successful, they believe they can become successful, and they're more motivated and engaged. And so you can imagine that this could happen over a minute, where the student gets an F. Oh, I'm not good at math. I hate math. I'm not a math person. I don't even want to go to class tomorrow. So within 1 minute, we're going through this cycle. Or as a researcher, you might say, I want to look and see what happens over the semester. And how do students feel, by the end of the semester and their grades, and see how that affects different types of things, and how that affects how the motivational climate established by the teacher and the other students in the class, how that affects things. So again, it's a dynamic nature of this. One way we've looked at this is to examine fluctuations over time. And so here in a 15-week course, we surveyed students every 3 weeks. And then here's what you see here is each of the music components. So that interest was the lowest, and then empowerment, and the other 3 are up here. And so we can look over time. Does it change or does it stay the same? Well, that's part of what we're trying to do in our research, is to look at that. Here we have another class where I'm just looking at usefulness. We did this for all of music, but just for usefulness, you can see the median is represented by this black line here. And then we have the box plots and whiskers and outliers. But you can see how it fluctuates over time. What you see here, like with the green and red, this is motivation and effort. But the effort, the green line, it's not just effort, it's the correlation between usefulness and effort. So now the green line is showing us how usefulness is correlated with effort over time. which again gets to the complex interactions among these variables. So we're trying to consider those complex interactions and the dynamic nature. Here, these time points, there's 15 time points. Every single week we surveyed students. And so we're trying to find out, how does this change over time? And what happened was we talked to the instructor and he wrote down what he was doing every week. And so in his instructor's log, and so then we could determine, oh, that week was a quiz. Oh, that was a review week. Oh, that's why interest went down. Oh, that's why their perceptions of success went down right before the quiz because they weren't sure. And then after the quiz, it was a good quiz. Oh, their perceptions went up again. Oh, so we're trying to explain here what happens when teachers use different strategies, how that affects the climate, and then affects students' motivation, engagement, and ultimately learning. Um, so for the future, one thing we're thinking about is which components of the motivational climate fluctuate significantly over time and in which context. I mean, if these lines are flat, as a teacher, that tells you something as a teacher. Maybe you don't need to, you could survey at time 2 and that would be it. You wouldn't have to keep doing it every week. Or you could do it at week 2, especially if it goes down here, and figure out where you may need some help, and then try to change things in the course as a teacher to try to get these lines back up if they're going back down. And so those are some of the types of things we're looking at now. Let's talk about levels of variables for this next part. So this is the third aspect of the complex dynamic system that we look at. By levels, um, I want to first explain what we did in one study. We focused on gender and majors. So this example you're going to see is focused on gender and majors here. It could be something else if you weren't interested in that. But at the basic level here, it's going to be the bottom of the figure. We're looking at the individual level. So no students are grouped together. We see students who identify as men as an M, women as a W, and students who identify as non-binary as NB. And so we have each of the individual students we could look at. Or we could start to group students. And in this particular study, we had computer science students. So we wanted to see in the green who were the computer science students and who were the non-majors who might be taking this computer science class. Maybe they're a math major or some other engineering related discipline, but they weren't specifically computer science majors. That was the interest of our study. Now we can also move up to the meso level where we have groups by gender within majors. So now we can look at women who are majors, women who are non-majors, and so forth. And then at the top level here, we have the macro level where we have one group with all students in the course. And as as you can probably see, we consider Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory here in some ways as we think about these different levels. And so let me give you now some examples of studies and how we've done this and sort of what we found going through. Kaplan and Garner noted, pragmatically, however, no single research project can capture the entirety of a multi-layered hierarchy of a complex system. Hence, researchers must foreground a particular level or levels of the system to serve as the focus of the research project and as a unit of analysis, and then background other levels. So here, I think this is important because they're saying, you're not going to be able to do all of these levels. So foreground a particular level and let people know what you're doing. Think about what you're doing and then explain it to others. And let me give you a few examples here. So in one study, we said, okay, we're going to highlight the individual level. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, in this study, if we look, M is empowerment down here, and we have 5 time points. So every 3 weeks, we surveyed students, and this is how 2 of the students rated their empowerment. We have student C in blue and student D here. And so they're sort of similar, but there's some differences. On the first week, student D was higher than student C. And so here we're looking at the individual level, individual students. And we did this for usefulness, success, interest, and caring as well. You can see there's some pretty big difference in terms of usefulness here at all 5 weeks. And so student C is on board with the usefulness, right? They're saying, hey, this course hits useful. I see why it's useful. Whereas student D is sort of like, yeah, not so much. I'm kind of in the middle. So if we'd aggregated all of these students, we would have lost this important information. So looking at the student level really allows us to look at this and say, really empowerment and success are pretty similar, but these are different. Why is that? Who is this student D And why are they different? And are they a part of a larger group that we could investigate? That would be interesting to look at. Now, if we move up at the micro level, one thing we've done is look at profiles, and I'm going to explain that to you here in a minute. So we group students now not only by gender, but by profiles. So here's a study that we did. We published in the Journal of Educational Psychology, where we looked to see whether middle school science students could be grouped according to their music perceptions of science. And we found that in this profile one were students who they really rated music high across all 5 components of the music model. So if they did that, they were up here. And this is done statistically through a cluster analysis. Students who rated them low were placed in this bottom one. And then we had students here who were sort of in the middle. This purple profile number 4 is pretty interesting in that these are students who thought that they could be successful, higher on success and higher on caring, but lower on usefulness and interest. So for those students, you need to focus on here and here. You don't need to convince to try to be caring. They already believe that. But for these students, you want to focus on these. So we're able to put students in groups based on their profiles. And these profiles then show the complex interactions, going back to part of CDS, between the music variables. So if you're high on some and low on others, you're placed in a profile based on that. And so that's pretty cool. Now we can also think about the levels here. And so we can think about gender within these profiles. And so to do that, it's pretty easy to pull out the women and compare the women's profiles to the profiles for the men. And now we're kind of at the meso level. We're looking at those two things. And if you really want extra credit, you can you can move up to look at the levels of the you can move on to the dynamic nature over here. So now we're not only considering the complex interactions and dynamic nature, but now we're considering over time. So week 12, here's what it looked like for men and women. And then here's at week 15 down here what it looks like. And so we're really hitting on everything. And we can talk about the context of the system, which is a computer science course at a university and so forth. Okay, now let me give you one example before we leave levels up at the macro level. Typically what we do up here is we give instructors collect data at the class level, so they group everybody together. What's the average from all students in the course? And in terms of the positives, it's very practical for teachers. They can get these data pretty quickly and they can see where their class is at. And so that's cool and that's helpful. But one problem is it likely doesn't represent all students, right? We saw that in the other graph there. Not every student is going to find it caring. It's 5.1. Well, I bet there's some students who might find usefulness a 2 or a 3. And so again, we're by averaging, yeah, we have an average sort of, but that's not going to necessarily represent every student, especially across all time points. So, so that's we have to consider what are the positives and what are the negatives of using these different approaches. In the future, that's one thing we want to think about more is how can motivational climate be studied in a large course? Now, say you have over 100 students. Is it really possible to have a motivational climate up here at the macro level? Is there one climate that all 100 students really have? Or do we have to look at these group levels? And if so, what can this tell us? And is it useful? Is it really useful to look by majors or by gender or profiles? And that's the type of thing we're exploring now in our research. But we're trying to be very intentional about which levels we're looking at and then thinking about how that informs our knowledge and what the results are and the implications as a result of that. Okay, then let's move on to the last of the 4 aspects that we really focus on, which is the context of the system. So as you can see here, the music model is being used in at least 46 countries. And I know that because I've gotten emails from people in all of these countries and they want to use an inventory and they've wanted to translate it, and we've worked with them to translate it and we validated some of the translations. And so given that, one sort of obvious way to consider context is by comparing different countries. And so in this one study we published, we looked at over 1,000 university students in English language courses. We wanted to see how different contexts may affect students' perceptions of the motivational climate in these different countries. And so what we found is that the music perceptions did predict behavioral engagement, which then led to achievement. It worked like we thought it would, which was sort of interesting. This example really highlights the role of context and considering the differences between them. That was sort of the purpose of it. And it provides evidence for the music model in these different contexts. And what's sort of amazing to me is this, I mean, look at this percent of variance explained, how similar these numbers are. I mean, these inventories, these surveys they were translated to different languages. They were used in different classes. We grouped classes together in these different countries, put them together in this model, and yet the amount of variance explained is almost identical. I mean, it's amazing that this can happen. So again, this is a linear way of looking at it, yes, but we're trying to provide some background before we move on to the more complicated, complex interactions that can occur. And so we have pretty good data now to show how these things work in different situations. But again, it's not a complex system yet, but we're just trying to consider context, and then we'll look at context in different ways and try to do some of these other things related to a CDS. Another way we've done this is looking at different courses. So here we have 4 different courses, and we looked at how the motivational climate variables correlated with engagement as effort. We used effort as a measure of engagement. You can see here that in terms of the 4 different courses, the relationships between these variables and effort was a little bit different depending on the class. And so that shows us that context is important. These dashes mean that they weren't statistically significant correlations. Okay, and then another way, more recently what we've done is we had one class taught by 3 different instructors. And so now we've surveyed students at the end of every chapter that they covered. There were 9 chapters, and at the very end of the course. And we looked to see, we tried to keep everything about the same, except for teachers had latitude in terms of what they did in the classroom, but the objectives for the course were the same, the assignments were the same, everything else was the same. It was the same type of students who were in these classes. And you can see here a comparison that context does matter, because somehow whatever this instructor won, this blue line instructor here, whatever they were doing, that climate wasn't rated as highly as these other 2. And so then we can go back and we have the instructor's logs, and we can look and see sort of what that teacher did compared to the other 2 in class. How was it that different that these values could be so different? And it highlights not only the dynamic nature of these interactions, but also the context of the system. And again, this is at the class level, these averages. So we know not all students would have these same exact perceptions, but overall, on average, here's what it looked like. Okay, so let me put the pieces together here. One way we've done that is we've used in-depth case studies, which is consistent with suggestions from scholars who conceptualize motivation as a CDS. And we found that these case studies have been very useful in our work as well. So let me give you an example of 2 of these. One is called Using Video Game Design to Motivate Students. It was an article we published in 2017. And this was an after-school program with 10th and 11th graders. And we did it for 8 weeks. Sometimes we did the program once a week, sometimes twice a week. So it was 11 sessions total. And students designed a video game. We used Spore, which is about science and biology. And so the topic of the game was science. And they were designing their own video game. And we used a case study approach where we interviewed students 3 times, one near the beginning, one in the middle, and one near the end of these 11 sessions. And then we also observed them and took field notes. And so our interview questions were things like, for usefulness, like how useful is this activity for your goals this year or in the future? You know, in what ways is it useful? So we tried to ask them questions related to each of the 5. And I think that's what's unique about our perspective, is that we really focus on all 5 aspects of the motivational climate in all of our studies to try to see which of these, and sometimes some of these may be more important than others, but we don't necessarily know until we get into it. And that's why we do it. And so as a result of that, we came up with, we showed case studies of three of the students. And here's two of them, Jack and Mia. And Mia said when we asked her about empowerment, we gave her questions that related to the empowerment category. She said, I have complete control. I have control over what aspects of science I put into it, what the plot line is, and the characters. Okay, great. And so then we asked her about usefulness, and she said, "Oh, it's going to be a big deal in the future when I try to go to college. When I try to go for college and medical school." So clearly, she saw the importance of that. And again, we asked them questions here about success. I'm not going to go through the whole study, but this showed us how three different students interacted differently with this activity and how they were affected by it and how the motivational climate was created based on this same activity that they all engaged in, the instructor's teaching strategies, which were to give short presentations and use SPORE, and how that affected the motivational climate and their motivation engagement, but also then how that interacted with their existing goals. I want to go to medical school. Okay, cool. Based on that, how does that affect your perception of the motivational climate? We had another student, Jack, there, who was really interested in video game design. So he didn't really care about the science as much, but he really cared about learning how to design a video game and the different aspects and the colors and the characters and so forth. And so that got him motivated. So we were able to capture that not only through the usefulness, but to see that he was empowered to make choices about that he had a caring instructor, that he enjoyed working on this project, and he felt like he could be successful with the support system there. And so we were able to really capture this complex dynamic system and how it motivated him to engage in that activity. Okay, let me give you one more example here of it's sort of a similar program. It was an after-school program for middle school students. And here we did 12 sessions after school. And these students designed mini solar-powered cars. And you can see one here. And what they did was they had to pull weight with it. So the more weight that they could pull, the more, the better their project was designed because it had more power. And so um, here we did a mixed method study where we did surveys and then we conducted interviews and we also observed the sessions and we had an observation form that we used. And you can see here the table from the study where, again, like I said before, we consider this idea about motivating opportunities. So students work together in groups of 3 to build these solar cars. And we found that it was an opportunity for students to interact with other students. Okay, great. So that could affect what we found was their perceptions of success. Yeah, I can be more successful because I don't have to do it by myself, and they know something about this part, and I know something about this part. We can work together. Yay, we're happy, we're successful. And also caring, so that you're working with people who care about you and want to work with you. Now, that's an opportunity because we all know how group work is. It can also go the other way, right? Where they don't like the people they're working with, the other people, they don't get along. And so that motivating opportunity then makes them have a bad motivational climate. They perceive the motivational climate to be bad, and then they're not motivated to engage, and they don't come back the next week because they don't want to work with that person in that group. And so, again, what I think was interesting about our research is we're identifying these motivating opportunities. And so we're getting instructors and we go back to them and say, look, you got to be careful about your group interactions and make sure that the students are getting along. And if they're not, you got to have them work together and work things through. And again, these aren't new ideas. Teachers know this, but we're able to document it now and think about it in this way. And there's other aspects of instruction here we were able to do that with, which was pretty cool. So again, we're looking at the cars, the instructional environment, and then how that affected the climate and the motivation and engagement. So we specifically focused on that aspect of the bigger music model here. Okay, and I already said that here was the opportunity to motivate or not. So let me conclude here and then leave you all a time for some questions here at the end with my last few slides to kind of summarize what I've gone over here. I know it was quite a bit. In terms of complex interactions, we view the interactions among the music perceptions. We view that as leading to the emergence of this motivational climate, either in a course, it could be at a different level. I don't know that I said that it's at the course level or an activity level or whatever level you're looking at, however you want to define your system. And as well, we looked at the complex interactions among all these we don't look at all of them, but we select some from some of these boxes and try to see how they interact with one another to understand students' motivational processes a little bit better. And again, we consider it dynamic over time, that it can happen quickly, or you can look over a longer period of time to try to understand how these variables interact with one another. And we have this idea about levels of variables where students can go through this music model. We can look at one student and how they perceive the instruction and how they're motivated and the outcomes affect in their cycle. Or we can group students and start to see how do women or men or students who identify as non-binary, how do they go through this system? Or how do women who are in a certain profile and so forth? We can look at the meso level, or we can just look at the whole class and see from a whole class perspective how this may work. So I'll conclude then by saying that the complex dynamic system really provides a language and a framework that's useful in our study of motivational climate. I'd sort of had these ideas for over 20 years and kind of been doing it, but I didn't necessarily have the language. And I think I've enjoyed using complex dynamic systems over the past few years because it's helped me then use a language that's consistent with what other people are doing. And it's also helped me to think about it. It really pushed us to think about how we approach our work and how we interpret it and then how we explain it to others. And I think that's one real strength of using a CDS is it allows us to do these things. So I'll stop at this point for our last 15 minutes here and see if you have any questions and so forth. Here's my information. And obviously, feel free to contact me if you have any questions or want to talk about any aspects of this. I'll turn it over to Hande at this point and see if, are you going to take questions?
Yeah, thank you. I think now we will be able to receive a few questions before we end the session.
I know there wasn't much in here, so it's probably so clear that nobody has any questions about any aspect of it.
So, what are you, what are your guys' future plans with integrating like complex dynamic systems into your work? I know you talked about like using the different levels, but do you guys have any studies that you have coming up, and specifically like what level and like time scales are you planning to investigate at?
Yeah, good question. Well, we have a bunch of ideas. Right now, we've been focused and we want to do a little bit more in these large introductory level STEM courses
Okay.
that I think can be problematic for students. And so we've really been trying to understand at that level, not just at the course level, which we have data on from the past 5 years. I have course level data, but digging into it a little bit deeper and looking more by groups. I mean, does it matter how they're grouped by gender? It turns out that in these courses, women tend to rate their success perceptions lower than men, and it's pretty statistically significant. And that's not, and people in computer science know that already, that women have lower self-efficacy in general. So what can we do in the course then to facilitate that? We found that, so I'm just giving you an example here. So for example, it's not so much about the belongingness in this particular scenario. They rated caring exactly the same as men. So in this one particular course, then we can focus more on self-efficacy and think about types of interventions we can use as part of the course design to help women in that course. And so, yeah, it's sort of thinking about how do we do it in these bigger courses when you have so many. I mean, we have 600 students in a course here at Virginia Tech, and how do you really address every single student? Is that possible? And I don't know, but how can we make it better for most of the people most of the time, and I guess just as importantly, not make it bad for some students, which I think is something that can happen pretty easily if some people will say, well, there's nothing new about the music model. All good teachers know this. Yeah, they know it, but they have to do it, right? And myself included, when I design my own class, I still have to remember these things and I still have to do them. Because if you don't do one of them, and if you do one of them really badly, sometimes it can really bring the others down. For example, if you say something in class that's really demeaning to someone or someone interprets it as a way that's offensive to them, it can really affect them in that class for the rest of the semester. And so we really have to be cognizant of those types of things, and but trying to understand who are these students that rate things really lowly, if there are those students, and then what can we do about it. So I don't know. There's other things, Allie, that we're considering, but that's kind of on the top of our list, at least for the next few months here. Yeah. Now, if you have any great suggestions, please let me know, and we'll, consider them. So.
Okay, yes, Bridget, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello. I just first want to take the opportunity to say hello to Professor Jones. I am very happy to see him and to hear him again.
Yeah, great to see you. It's been a while, so super. Hope things are going well with you.
Yeah, it's everything good. And say hello everyone from Colombia, from Bogota, Colombia. So I'm hearing your conference from here. I am just wondering about something. I have a question about why did you decide to group the students by gender? It's, I don't know, now that I hear you, is maybe because the self-efficacy relationship that you just mentioned, but I am just wondering why the gender is one reason to group the variables, to group the students, sorry.
Yeah, and that particular study, in terms of engineering, has an issue with gender, where they don't have as many female students, except for in some cases like biology and some bio types of engineering. But computer science is probably the worst. They have about 19% female students, and they go on to pursue careers. So you have 80% men, roughly 20% women, and they're trying to change that. And so they've been trying to change it for decades, and they've made progress. Well, they did make progress for a while, but it seems now that it's been gone down a little bit more again more recently, in the last few years. And so they're trying to figure out why. And so we were kind of trying to help them with that. So that's why in that particular case, in computer science, we were focused on gender. But were there reasons? Have you used gender in your own work at all, or reasons not to use it, or?
No, commonly we don't use gender as commonly it's just to describe, generality, like this percent is men, this percent is women, but not for something else. But it's interesting to me because I thought that maybe, how to say this, like if maybe the characteristic being woman or being man is related in some way with this with the motivation in their classroom. At least I am with my students here. I don't see so much difference between women and men, but yeah, it's just to say percentage, just but not in relationship with the particular other variables that I have studied.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and a lot of times we don't either, to be honest, in a lot of particular and we see a lot of similarities. But in computer science, I have a graph to show it, but we found that empowerment, men felt more empowered and more successful than women in computer science. And so that may be one reason why there's fewer women. But we're not looking at reasons why they go into computer science. So I should clarify, we're just looking at once they get there, what do they think about this particular class? But the other interesting thing to think about is the women may be right. Like the way they're rating their success perceptions, they may be more accurate than men. In a 2010 study we did in Journal of Engineering Education, we sort of found that when we looked at the correlations, it seemed like because women were achieving as highly as men. And so it wasn't that they were necessarily wrong. It may be that the men are overconfident. Right. So they're actually it's all about their perception. The music model is certainly all about their perception, and that most of psychology is about our perceptions. But they tended to be overconfident, whereas women tended to be a little bit more accurate. So it's not necessarily a deficit for women, but as a result of that, maybe and that's what we have to figure out. Is that a problem for women? Just because it's lower doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. But that's something I guess I would like to understand a little bit better. I think people have studied that. I haven't, but I mean, I think other people have and understand that better than I do, in terms of what that means for women. And I think the obvious thing is that when you come up to a challenge, if you're overconfident, you tend to keep going on and fight through it and persevere. Whereas women, if you're accurate or a little bit lower than accurate, that maybe you're not as likely to persevere, or you might have reasons to disengage because you don't feel like you can do it. And so then it would become a problem. But if they're accurate and it's okay and they're persevering, then it's not a problem. It's just they have, they're not as overconfident as the men are. So.
And you can see that a lot in mathematics. That is actually, it has been proof that women, we are less confident in mathematics than men.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. It was great to see you, Bridget. I'm glad you joined today. We'll have to catch up sometime. Bridget used to be a student here at Virginia Tech, so you've been gone for a while. How many years have you graduated?
Almost 1 year and a half.
Okay, yeah.
And let me tell you that now I will start a research about motivation, about self-efficacy in my students.
Oh, great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Thank you, Bridget. Could we say that the context determines or dictates the levels of unit of analysis you want to focus on? Because you said computer science students are grouped in this particular study, they are grouped by gender because gender issues were relevant, and this issue dictated or determined the level of unit of analysis you want to focus on in that motivational climate system, right?
Yeah.
So can we say that context determines or dictates the levels of unit of analysis you want to focus on? Or what else, in which ways can we group students?
Yeah, well, I think it is related to context, but probably more directly to your research question, right? So what you want to know as a result of it. And so if the research question is about what are the gender differences, then you're right, that research question came up because of the context in which this was an issue. So as a result of that context, we raised these research questions, which then led to the unit of analysis, which was at the meso or micro level in that case. So yeah, that's a good point, to show how these things can affect one another, can affect your decisions as a researcher, I guess. Yeah, good point.
So we can also group students by, for example, language, right? ESL, EFL students. If our research questions are related to language barriers in understanding the domain, for example, or courses.
Right. Yeah, if you wanted to determine differences in motivation based on their level of English proficiency. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, good point. And I think as Avi Kaplan and Joanna Garner noted in their paper there, that it's which of these do you want to foreground, that we can't do all of these, but we're going to foreground, we're going to focus on sort of these for this. We know there's other levels. We know there's a meso level, micro, but for this study, we're looking at this level for these reasons. And in this context, that's what's important. Well, I guess theoretically it's possible to do everything. It's hard to study all that and write it all in one paper and consider it all at once. So, maybe you focus on one thing at a time at least, or something, or one or two of these levels at a time. Or compare them and say, well, look, here we are at the class level. And we did this in our paper. Hyundai and I wrote a paper in 2022, the one with the individual levels here on the slides, where here's what the class level said, and then here's what students said, and you can sort of compare and see where there may be differences or what issues may arise as a resulting of looking at different units of analysis.
Okay, thank you. And one last question from Diego. I think Diego also put in the chat that they are currently validating the inventory. Yes, Diego, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Greetings again, Dr. Jones. We are currently validating the inventory for university students with some good results. Even so, we talking about the motivational climate. It is difficult to separate the macro context from what happens within the classroom. For example, the energy and security crisis that we are experimenting currently. However, we have seen that the music model contributes to student retention in our institute.
Oh, great. Oh yeah, I'd like to hear more about that. Good to talk to you again, Diego. Thanks for mentioning that. And I'm glad it's been of use to you to think about motivational climate that way. And I'll be interested to hear the outcomes of your study. Let's keep in touch about that. So great.
Okay. Thank you. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, please join me in thanking Brett for his rich presentation today.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been so much fun to put this together and to get me to think about how my work, how I could explain some of my work for this. So I enjoyed doing it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we would like to take a moment to remind you to join or renew your membership with AERA Complexity Theories in Education 617 to stay updated on our latest activities, opportunities, and events. In addition to our monthly newsletters, please follow us on our social media channels to stay updated. And this year, we will once again be hosting the Sprint Mentoring session. The Mentoring Sprint opportunity will begin in January 2025 and run for approximately 12 weeks. It will culminate in a work-in-progress style poster presentation during our SIG programming at the annual meeting of AERA in Denver in April 2025. The applications will close on January the 3rd, and we will be back in touch by January 20th. Please feel free to share this information with interested graduate students or colleagues. And for more information, please refer to our December newsletter that we shared in the chat earlier. And thank you for joining us tonight. It was so much fun to discuss motivational climate as a complex dynamic system. And as always, feel free to reach out to us. And we will see you. We hope to see you in our next webinar next month. Good night.
Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you. And you can